Stockholm Seminar with Kristina Gjerde. My name is Henrik Kostblom and I'm Deputy Science Director at the Stockholm Resilience Center. Kristina is here today to give you a talk on UNCLOS and some unfinished business. The talk is on marine biodiversity beyond national boundaries. And the real reason for Kristina to be here is to be speaking at the Royal Academy again tomorrow in a seminar on the ocean in a +2 degrees world with lots of really interesting and distinguished speakers and a full day of talks of the challenges that we're facing. And you need to remain in your seats now, but there are, I think, 10 slots left, so you can sign up there in the back and register for them if you want to. But that's sort of a full day tomorrow. But it's a real privilege and honor to have Kristina here. And for those of you who don't know her, Kristina is a high seas policy advisor for the IUCN. She's also an adjunct professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And she has been working tirelessly to raise concerns and issues and awareness of the high seas and ocean issues for many years. She's a lawyer, and she's also published substantially on these issues in both Science and Nature and many other issues. So, real pleasure to have you here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege and honor to be back here again. Welcome everyone. Last time I was here was in 1992. That's for the second symposium on ecological economics, which is unfortunately, I think, before many of you were born. But this is indeed a beautiful city, and I do have some Swedish heritage in the American mongrel mix, but it is indeed a pleasure to be here. And what brings us all together is I'm hoping our interest in the ocean, including that ocean that is beyond national boundaries. I like to start with this picture because in many ways it sort of describes our perception of what is out there, which is plain, boring nothingness. Well, this painting was considered unfinished in an art exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of New York on unfinished art. And for them it was unfinished because it was missing people, animals, ships. For the Law of the Sea Convention, which is a beautiful overarching agreement that sets forth the rights and duties of states and humans in dealing with the oceans, they, at least I would put forward, did not truly consider the full range of life that is in the ocean and the need to have a more comprehensive approach to dealing with conservation, long-term protection, and preservation. It's great on sectoral activities, shipping, fishing, sets out a useful framework, but what is missing and is now time to develop is that framework for cooperation to truly deal with our life support system in areas beyond national boundaries. That was, like many of you, perhaps, my first encounter with the ocean and why I left a career of shipping law, admiralty law, for nature conservation was my first scuba dive. I went to Palau, many others have been elsewhere, but it's the beauty and vibrancy and diversity of the life that is contained within such a small percentage of our ocean that was truly astonishing and convinced me to want to work to protect what was in the ocean and not just what sailed on top of the ocean. But it wasn't until 2001 when I went to a workshop in Wilm, Germany in the Baltic Sea, tiny island of Rügen, that I learned about the fact that coral reefs could exist in frigid waters of Norwegian fjords as well as in high seas seamounts, and that these corals were being quickly eradicated so that the bottom of our seabed was soon looking like the backside of the moon. And the problem, of course, was another dark hole in ocean law is that even though the Law of the Sea Convention divides up the ocean space into the high seas, the area in darker blue, and the lighter blue, which is areas within national jurisdiction, Norway was able to quickly enact laws to say no intentional damage of corals in the process of fishing. But at the United Nations level, at the Regional Fisheries Management Organization, there were no such rules in place. That's since 2001, we've learned a lot about the various values of the high seas, in addition to its astonishing variety and diversity of life, and the fact that it is actually operating as a carbon storehouse, that it is taking the carbon that we are emitting into the atmosphere and containing it within its wealth of ocean waters, its depth, as well as the seabed below. I read an astonishing figure that Minister Isabella Lövin was quoting, is that if we did not have the oceans, the planet would be 36 degrees warmer based on the excess carbon dioxide emissions that the ocean has been absorbing, that 93% of the energy emitted from climate change. So it is serving us a very good service, but also providing us with food sources. That's almost 2/3 of the fish that we are catching are actually straddling exclusive economic zones and the high seas. So even if we are catching these fish in the exclusive economic zones, overfishing on the high seas will have food security concerns. So the good news, of course, is that from 2001 to 2017, governments debated, discussed, deliberated what are the best mechanisms to ensure biodiversity conservation, better sustainable use, how to better integrate the regime in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Is it just better use of existing instruments, or do we actually need a new legally binding agreement? And on December 24th, Christmas Eve, at the United Nations, the governments of the world unanimously adopted a resolution to launch 2 years of negotiations to develop a new international legally binding agreement, take a breath, for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, which is why I'm calling it the High Seas Biodiversity Agreement for short, and Ronan will correct me and I'll get to the area in a moment. There's two parts of areas beyond national jurisdiction. So anyway, this is Peter Thompson from Fiji. He was the president of the General Assembly. He is now the UN envoy, very supportive both of Sustainable Development Goal 14, as well as in terms of trying to move forward on this implementing agreement. And of course, the government of Sweden has been very strong on the SDG 14, as well as working within the European Union to ensure a strong agreement. So what I'm going to try to cover today, and I'm hoping if you do have questions to please raise your hand and we'll try to get to them in the course of this talk or afterwards, on what are the challenges that we are facing now as we move forward. What is the legal context that we're operating in? Patricia wanted to know, what are the laws that are relevant? Why aren't we using these as they exist? And then what I see as 7 key roles for the new instrument to try to fill in some of the gaps and weaknesses of the existing infrastructure. Of course, more obstacles ahead. We do have to try to plan ahead and see what we can learn, and then trying to discuss, since here we're filled with natural scientists, social scientists, lawyers, and other forms of expertise, what we can actually extract, contribute, build on in the process to try to move things ahead. I'm going to be focusing on the conservation, sustainable use side of the equation, but just so you are aware, part of the package that will be negotiated in New York is, of course, dealing with marine genetic resources, including questions on the sharing of benefits, that's capacity building, transfer of marine technology, in addition to area-based measures, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and other types of area-based tools. And then, of course, overarching and underpinning all of this are the governance rules, the principles, the decision-making procedures that will enable, hopefully, science-based decision-making to proceed. With this UNGA resolution, 72/249, it just got a number, it's very exciting instead of L9, has laid out that, of course, this is a package deal, that like the Law of the Sea Convention, there are some issues that are more important to some states than others, but we have to resolve them all to the satisfaction of all, because our goal is to aim for consensus. We want to get as many players on board in a way that will, of course, ensure the widest possible participation. But of course, what we're also looking at is how do you respect the existing mandates, functions, institutions, and agreements that are already operating in this ocean space that affects or impacts marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. First organizational meeting coming up next month in April, actually, a month and a half. And the first substantive session, we have time to get prepared, is going to be in September. Of course, the UN diplomats are quite concerned because they're going to be very busy on all sorts of other issues at the same time. So we have time now to try to focus in and think, how do we make this circle become complete? How do we finish this business? I'm a sucker for weird ocean creatures, so you'll see a few of them invade the slides here. This one is a siphonophore that actually has no head nor tail, but is a colonial creature that manages to survive. It grows up to 30 meters in the deep ocean water column. It's a colonial creature. It needs one another in order to survive, even though they all have different functions. But it also finds a way to thrive, to prosper, and to move ahead. Can we do that in areas beyond national jurisdiction? Can we find a way to save the high seas while still observing and respecting the mandates of existing institutions? That's one of the challenges, but one that I wanted to work on, because what the scientists are telling us, and this is the report from the first global marine assessment done by scientists commissioned by the United Nations to say, what is the state of the ocean? What is the socioeconomic impacts of current activities? And the picture is not pretty, because we have decades of disposal of everything from radioactive material to dredge to sewage, and then decades of overfishing and destructive fishing practices. And these are now coming on top of changes involved with climate change, loss of oxygen, ocean acidification, warming temperatures, and the circles here are connecting the dots. And this was even the state of the art in 2011. They will have synergistic effects that make one impact far worse, two impacts far worse than any one impact on its own. And what the scientists are telling us is that we no longer have the luxury of just focusing on getting fisheries right or getting shipping laws right. We actually have to be tackling everything, focusing on building resilience, restoring ecosystem functions, processes, and maintaining the biodiversity that we have. But, of course, the challenge is yes, I do like penguins too. That was, this poor guy is sort of, he can't fly. He has to stay within his limited horizon. This is what we have with the existing sectoral institutions, is that they may operate well within their own space, but they don't have the perspective to look at the problems confronting the globe as a whole. And so our existing fragmented sector-based institutions of shipping, fishing, and seabed mining are no longer able to provide that sort of glimmer of what is going on in the ocean. How can our activity have an impact on other activities? Seabed mining, deep-sea bottom fishing, are those two compatible? You close one area to fishing and it's opened for seabed mining. Of course, other sectors are having problems doing their own job. I saw this graph from a scientist that where the biomass of Pacific bluefin tuna had been fished down to less than 3% of its original biomass before the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission opted to take some conservation action. And yes, there may be disputes as to the science, but with 3%, Daniel Dunn likes to say, you're lucky if you even find your mate. And the fact that overfishing is causing significant impacts on the diversity and functioning of this species in the ecosystem and the biosphere as a whole. And of course, we're hearing lots about marine protected areas, and even more importantly, marine reserves, where extractive activities are strictly limited, if not prohibited. And the science that is behind it is showing the role and value that these can have for building resilience to climate change. And I don't have time to go through it all, but just simply promoting the genetic diversity that supports adaptation, that was protecting apex predators that confer ecosystem stability, and of course, increasing the population size, giving the ocean a break. We also don't have mechanisms to date for integrating biodiversity considerations into the decision-making processes of these sectoral activities. It's very easy to think about shipping and, well, maybe we will reduce CO2 impacts, but what about the physical impacts of ships on sargassum weed? What about the physical impacts of ships on sea turtles and whales? How do we better manage that in areas beyond national jurisdiction? So yes, we do have a legal framework, and it is important to build upon this, recognizing that there are freedoms of the high seas, of shipping, fishing, marine scientific research, laying of cables. But at the same time, we also recognize that these are conditioned and elaborated on in the Law of the Sea Convention and subsequent laws. This is where Ronan will at least be happy that I've learned my lessons. That was the high seas is not just the high seas. The high seas is everything in the water column that is beyond national jurisdiction, generally 200 nautical miles. That the seabed area is that area of the ocean floor that is beyond the extended continental shelf of coastal states. And that can extend even out to 350 nautical miles or sometimes even further, especially if you're Irish. These are subject to two very different regimes. That was the high seas, as we were saying, the freedom of the high seas. The area has actually been designated, and its resources, as the common heritage of mankind, to be managed on behalf of humankind as a whole. And that is through an international seabed authority that is responsible for actually adopting binding regulations on all states with respect to seabed mining, as well as sharing some of the benefits and controlling strictly environmental protection. Contrasting regimes. But all of these are governed by the overarching obligation under the Law of the Sea Convention to protect and preserve the marine environment. And this is in many ways, in my mind, the biggest obstacle, is we don't have anything that actually elaborates how this article is to be implemented in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The Law of the Sea Convention spends a lot of time, a lot of articles, a lot of page spaces talking about pollution controls, but the only thing it has with respect to ecosystems or biodiversity is this one little article, 194.5. So it's not even its own article about the obligation to protect and preserve rare or fragile ecosystems. It's the only one of two places that word occurs, and the habitat of depleted, threatened, or endangered species. Of course, our concepts of what is biological diversity and why you want to prevent these species from becoming depleted, threatened, or endangered has altered and advanced since 1982 when the convention was negotiated. And so the question is, how do you update the concepts, important concepts, in the Law of the Sea Convention to better adapt to conditions in 2018? Of course, the Law of the Sea Convention is not alone. It has been updated in some ways with respect to two implementing agreements, the UN Straddling Fish Stocks Agreement, others call it the Straddling and Highly Migratory Fish Stocks Agreement, and the Part 11 Agreement for seabed mining. But I just have time to talk about two of these. The Convention on Biological Diversity here, complemented by the Convention on Migratory Species, and then the Fish Stocks Agreement. The Convention on Biological Diversity is the most widely ratified instrument. The only major state that's not a party to the CBD is, of course, the United States, but they're also quite supportive of many of the activities. At least lots of aid was going to the Convention on Biological Diversity to support national activities. It's premised on the notion that the conservation of biological diversity is the common concern of humankind. To me, that means we're also expected to be cooperating together, to almost be doing our utmost to ensure that this great heritage of biological diversity is preserved and transmitted to future generations. That it talks about general measures for conservation and sustainable use. Article 6, these will be important later. It won't be a test, but we'll refer back to them, which is each contracting party is supposed to develop national strategies, plans, or programs and integrate as far as possible and appropriate the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond, of biodiversity. The issue, of course, is that the Convention on Biological Diversity does not apply to the components of biological diversity. So some states have said, well, this doesn't apply to us. But the fact is that Article 8, which talks about in situ conservation on protected areas and taking measures outside protected areas, may not apply directly to components of biological diversity, but the CBD does apply to the processes and activities under national jurisdiction and control. And hence, you are allowed to exercise power, authority over your own nationals, your national vessels, and your citizens in order to achieve the aims. But of course, it's not obliged. But in situ conservation is more than just marine protected areas. It is about trying to preserve ecosystems in their entirety. And then this one, which does specifically refer to components of biological diversity, again talks about integrating biodiversity considerations into management of sectoral activities. What has the CBD done in terms of areas beyond national jurisdiction? Well, courtesy of Norway, that was in terms of when the CBD was talking about trying to create common criteria for identifying areas in need of protection beyond national jurisdiction. Norway came in and said, well, no, the sea floor, the water column above, once you're beyond the continental shelf, is in many ways subject to the same conditions, the same species, the same processes. So let's focus on the open ocean and deep sea habitat. And so this was the way they brought in the fact that there is cold water within national jurisdictions, there's cold water out beyond national jurisdiction, but many of the same criteria can be applied in both. So the basic criteria, of course, are uniqueness, special habitat areas beyond just your threatened declining species, special vulnerability, productivity, biodiversity, and of course naturalness. I like to use this picture of the Sargasso Sea, where I've been working with some of the colleagues in the room here in WWF Sweden to try to galvanize governmental, private sector, scientific efforts to help better manage the Sargasso Sea. But we're at a loss. How do you deal with 520,000 pieces of plastic per square kilometer at the heart of the Sargasso Sea? It takes your breath away. There's no place that is natural anymore. But by trying to remove the other threats that are on there, can you better manage shipping through the Sargasso Sea? Can you better manage fishing, seabed mining, in order to allow these ecosystems to use their own tools to better respond to increasing human impacts? So the CBD did not sit on its hands. It utilized these criteria, brought together the best scientific information in order to better understand areas of ecological or biological significance. And they've put together this map and this very rich resource base, which actually describes the workshops in a variety of regions. And yes, they are huge. This basically spans the entire Pacific Ocean, the Pacific transition boundary currents. But they've also recognized that we need to accommodate higher productivity levels, migratory corridors that are important for elephant seals and sharks and tuna that are swimming from the west coast of the US to Japan and back. They're not using this entire area, but some areas are more important than others, depending on the surface temperature. So we need to start thinking creatively. And what this information can hopefully tell us is that these are areas where we need to be exercising greater care of our sectoral activities, fishing, shipping, seabed mining, or everything together. They provide a good first glimpse for where we'd want to put marine protected areas, recognizing you're not going to close off to fishing or shipping the entire North Pacific. At least Rashid Somalia is not here. Others may be suggesting that. Fish stocks agreement, back to international law. Okay, it talks about the need for long-term conservation and sustainable use of highly migratory and straddling fish stocks. And then also has this lovely provision about protecting biodiversity in the marine environment. But for those who have been following shark fisheries for many years know that there is sort of a very important weakness in the implementation of that. First it was bycatch of shark species, then it was targeted shark species. We are losing shark species by the millions every year, and the RFMOs have yet to really respond in a major way. They are making progress, but without the national input, without the NGO input, without the scientific input, it's a very hard rock to push uphill. Similarly, with deep-sea bottom trawling, it was not until a coalition of governments, scientists, and NGOs came together that the UNGA finally decided to act to say, whoops, we better put a hold on this. We actually, governments adopted a resolution that said, we're going to protect vulnerable marine ecosystems. We're going to better manage our fisheries, or we're not going to authorize individual fisheries to proceed. That's pretty hard-nosed stuff. It did indeed galvanize action in the Northeast Atlantic, in the Southeast Atlantic, in the Pacific Ocean. It even galvanized the formation of new regional fisheries organizations in order to manage it. The UNGA said, do this by 2007, 2008, and has proceeded to have workshops every 3-4 years to actually require governments to report back what progress has been made, what more needs to be done in order to implement better management of deep-sea bottom fisheries. I would say it's been one of the most effective mechanisms, even though it did not come from the RFMOs themselves, but did have to be implemented at that level. I try to be humble. International law is not the whole answer to anything. So I'm trying to work with governance experts to better understand what makes one international agreement more effective than other, what makes clusters of international agreements at the regional and global level more effective than others. And of course, it's fairly simple, but of course, in theory, but very difficult in practice, and that is this concept of interplay, is how do you get sectors, scientists, organizations working on common principles, set of shared values, directed towards the same goal in a non-hierarchical way. These two studies, Robin Mahone and Oren Young, are some of the leading thinkers on the field. I was happy to sort of be able to inject myself. This is a more readable version that's actually looking at the status and threats of the open ocean and what some of the governance processes are. We looked at 100 different agreements and a variety of regional layers and levels, trying to figure out how they connected to the regional and global level. And those that had this were better off. But of course, the challenges of cross-sectoral cooperation are really what are besetting us all. That was the UN Global Environment Facility has been looking at how do you better enhance regional scale cooperation. And that is, of course, looking at the problems of different geographical coverages, different priorities, limited capacity. And what's been good is that the GEF has actually been putting some funds into supporting activities in the Western Indian Ocean and the Southeast Pacific. And I would suggest that's a type of effort that would need to continue under the new agreement. But also work needs to be done at the scientific level to improve ecological connectivity understanding, and then also at the national governance level. How do you create a more joined up approach to ocean governance? And of course, if we don't, we need to be able to understand what will happen if our adoption of the status quo or our failure to adopt an ambitious agreement is going to continue. And of course, Dan LaFoley likes to do the nice little graphics here that shine back and forth, but looking at, it's no longer just one impact that is the problem. It maybe was fishing before, pollution, mechanical habitat destruction. These all pave the way for greater introductions of alien species. But when you have multiple stressors, you end up getting simplified ecosystems that become out of balance and the synergistic effects that will no longer provide the services that we as humans rely upon. So going forward, what do we actually hope this new agreement will provide? I like to use this comb jelly here because he's actually has a head, actually able to provide that perspective and ideally oversight to move things along in a direction you need to go to. But 7 things, of course: building a network of marine protected areas, areas where wildlife, ocean ecosystem services has a chance to breathe. These again are the areas, the 47 EBSAs that have already been described by the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Of course, applying modern governance principles. We've seen how the Fish Stocks Agreement embodies this concept of ecosystem and precautionary approaches, but it has not yet been adopted at the International Maritime Organization for shipping. The International Seabed Authority is struggling, and then maybe even just as important is this participatory approach. The Global Commons is just that. It's something where we all have an interest in what is going on. How do you include human beings in the decision-making processes and make sure that we are all swimming in the same direction for the common goals? And then next, you may need some marine protected areas. But you also need to be able to manage activities outside of them. IUCN adopted a resolution saying, yes, we may want 30% no-take areas, but you need 100% sustainable use. That was, so even in a crowded city like New York, they're still able to set areas aside where no activities, or at least no parking occurs. But you still have lots of traffic on your city streets. But again, this traffic is not chaotic. It is actually managed in a way to allow pedestrians, to allow business to occur. And these can all be enhanced through simple environmental impact assessments, strategic environmental assessments of government plans and programs. And then possibly let's start thinking about marine spatial planning. Can we prevent conflicts of use? Can we encourage activities to complement one another rather than undermining one another? And of course, we have new activities on the horizon. Nautilus has built these 3 excavators and bulk cutters to go seabed mining on hydrothermal vents in Papua New Guinea. But the same equipment is soon to be applied in areas beyond national jurisdiction for seabed mining. The International Seabed Authority is developing exploitation regulations over the next couple of years, the same time as we're working at the UN to try to develop this new agreement for biodiversity conservation. So you have this delicate balance. Seabed mining is supposed to be for the benefit of humankind. It's supposed to enable profits to be shared or some form of compensation to go to developing countries who are desperately in need of new forms of income, desperately in need of new forms of scientific capacity to participate. But we need to make sure that it is sustainable. And the only way we're going to ensure that seabed mining is sustainable is by a speedy and deep injection of new scientific knowledge. And hopefully that is one of the things that we can get from the decade of ocean science for sustainable development that the UN has also proclaimed at the end of 2017. We have 3 years to develop the implementation plan and to galvanize support from private sectors, governments, civil society, and scientists to try to come through on how do we better manage ecosystems, or at least manage human activities that affect ecosystems. How do we include biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, look at new next generation observation technologies, monitoring for true essential ecological variables, and of course capacity building and information sharing. And one of the things that I actually find most important is the possibility of this new agreement to provide a platform for continued cooperation. Science is accelerating rapidly. Human impacts are accelerating rapidly. If we don't have an institution that has a more global perspective, we're going to continue to be outbalanced by the short-term sectoral interests that can weigh down progress in moving ahead. And if anything, the discussions at the United Nations General Assembly have already enabled governments to have that more global perspective to better understand the problems as they go forward. But our problem is that the government representatives shift around every 3 years or so, and so we also have a long-term continuing issue of maintaining that level of awareness and enthusiasm. And they've discovered that with the deep sea bottom trawling discussions, what's happened over the course of the past 4 years, governments have actually forgotten that this was an issue that people battled hard for many years. And so that constant presence of this issue and attention are really vital to moving forward. And then of course, there's lots of new technologies out there that can help to lighten our footprint on the human planet, from sails, solar sails for shipping fleets, to new pharmaceuticals, new advances in technologies that can help both national implementation, help manage and conserve and observe specific areas of the ocean, enhance our research as well as ocean innovation. And so concept Torsten Thiel is trying to promote this idea of an ocean sustainability bank. That was, he came from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development with my husband and says, well, why don't we have a place that can actually help inspire, underwrite ocean innovators, new forms of technology, but at the same time underwrite the structural reforms that are needed in order to bring all the government players into a common platform, common principles. And yes, we do have obstacles ahead. That was, the big elephant in the room may of course be Russia and the United States. Russia has been rather persistent in saying, what's in this for me? Why should we support it? We don't understand why you're trying to move ahead so quickly. Part politics, part stubbornness, and part probably lack of being listened to hear what their complaints are. And of course, the new regime in the United States, which does not necessarily support international engagement per se. But we do have, I think, the shorter term issue is really trying to look at the problems of how do you save the high seas without being perceived as undermining. We do need to align the existing organizations. We do need to be able to establish marine protected areas. And I like this so-called cosmic jellyfish for the idea that it actually has two sets of tentacles going up and going down. So it is, in many ways, the ultimate connector between the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach, trying to find that balance that enables you to survive and thrive in dark and scary circumstances. So just some ideas that I have that I hope we have time to discuss and explore is basically the role of trying to build on the Law of the Sea Convention, the Fish Stocks Agreement, and the CBD to outline general obligations to cooperate, specific criteria for areas in need of additional protection so that the sectors also have an obligation to adopt area-based tools. They have fisheries closures, they have vulnerable marine ecosystem closures, they have particularly sensitive sea areas, special areas. We have tools, we don't necessarily have the incentive to deploy them. And some of the ways that I would see this going forward is to build on that little article of Law of the Sea Convention 194.5, CBD Articles 8 and 10, Fish Stocks Agreement, UNCLOS, is obligation to cooperate, to establish a system of MPAs and adopt other effective conservation measures. Discussions at the UN have focused on a mechanism to establish marine protected areas, but in many ways I think they've forgotten about this fundamental obligation to cooperate and to adopt other effective tools. The obligations that are already in the Fish Stocks Agreement and the UN Convention to apply internationally agreed scientific criteria and guidelines. Why are not the EBSA criteria applied by international organizations? Well, because they didn't develop them themselves. So now we have to have a unified set of criteria for ways to go forward. To promote the protection of ecosystems in their natural surroundings, integrate biodiversity conservation, and adopt measures to avoid or minimize impacts. This should be common sense. This is SDG 14.2. That was, hopefully governments are not scared about incorporating these elements of obligations into their national priorities, into their international priorities in making decisions that will affect us all. And then finally, what is the role of science and scientists as we're going forward? I've only picked a few, of course, but again, is to try to understand those cumulative impacts that we're all going to be bearing the results of. And for fisheries management, you can't manage fish if your fish stocks are someplace else. If they are so small that they're no longer spawning, if they are fleeing up to the frigid northern waters. We need to be able to understand what the removal of sharks, of sea turtles, of declining water quality will do to the sustainability of fisheries for the next 40 years. And of course, scientists are diplomats. that was colleague Harriet Harden Davies is working to try to promote this whole field of science, go into these international informations to ensure the best available science information is applied, but also to promote the role of science in decision making and the role of more science and the role of science for building the capacity of our colleagues in developing countries. And that can only be done through open access to information and data and samples. We really need to take that whole mode of operation that we're seeing in other fields of science and start to apply it in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And of course, I was inspired by the website and the idea that resilience thinking is being applied to national biodiversity strategies and action plans under the conventional biological diversity. That's their mechanism for integrating. They're trying to apply resilience thinking into climate change thinking into national development strategies. Can we do some of the same for areas beyond national jurisdiction? I'm not as familiar with the literature, or not at all, on resilience thinking for ABNJ or resilience thinking, but what I've seen really strikes me as it goes to the heart of many of the concepts that we are striving for. And so I'm very happy to be here in the heart of resilience thinking at the Stockholm Resilience Center to try to see what we can all absorb, explore, and contemplate to try to bring us all together. And then, of course, finishing with the unfinished business of the Law of the Sea Convention, just to share some parting thoughts that I hope will stimulate some conversation, discussion to come, is we have a common platform. We need that we have agreed on the need for a new legally binding agreement to enhance the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. But we won't make progress if instrument is perceived as undermining existing institutions. Whoops, I'm trying to speed up. But sectoral approaches, as are currently practiced, are really part of the problem. It's a continuing example of short-term, short area, limited perspective thinking. But so if you don't find a way to join them up, we're going to have some nasty effects. So we do need to promote the integration of biodiversity into decision making at all levels. And hopefully we'll consider the potential value, role, and importance of resilience thinking. Because what we really do need going into the future is how to inject resilience thinking into our ecosystems as well as into our management institutions. So with that, I will close up. It's of course not the end. We have at least 2 more years of discussions, but then there are decades of implementation and cooperation. So I will look forward to exploring this new world with you. Thank you.